Hello, guys. Welcome back to today's podcast episode on the Soul Spiral. Today, I have Caitlin Pender joining me. Caitlin is a registered physiotherapist and a qualified yoga, Pilates, and Barre instructor with specialized training in pelvic floor and physiotherapy. She works with women to help them feel empowered about their pelvic health and even has her own podcast, Things They Don't Tell Her, All You Weren't Taught About Periods, Pregnancy, and Beyond. And she is my pelvic floor specialist or therapist through my journey that I'm beginning, or I'm almost midway through, gosh. So I'm very happy to have Caitlin join me. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so fun. So I like to kick off the podcast with a question to open. So the question I have for you is, how do you nourish and expand your soul?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I try and nourish my soul through movement and exercise. Obviously, my background as a physio has really exposed me to the impact of not looking after our physical bodies. So I incorporate a regular yoga or Pilates practice into my daily routine. And I also know the importance of nourishing my sort of emotional body and mental health. So I try and do a regular either pranayama practice or meditation.
So nice and such juicy, important things to incorporate in that. I don't know, that those things feel really light to me. Like I really enjoy incorporating those sorts of things into my practice as well. There's just like a lightness that it brings into your being after you've done those things, isn't there?
Yeah. And I think it doesn't have to be complicated. I always like to simplify things. So I just, sometimes it's just 10 minutes in the morning or just taking a moment to do some ujjayi breaths through the day.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, 10 minutes is all I'm doing movement wise at the moment in the morning. Yeah. We're getting back there though.
Absolutely.
I wanted to know if you would share a little bit about your journey, Caitlin, and how you came to be like a pelvic floor specialist, because it's quite a niche kind of area to work in, or pelvic floor physiotherapist, I should say.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there is some reason why this work lights you up.
Absolutely. So my journey is actually a funny one, and it was not something I intended when I moved into this path. So I finished high school and then I took a year off to work out, well, mostly to travel and work out what I wanted to do. And I was tossing up between studying medicine, paramedics, or physiotherapy. And my dad asked me the question, what do you think is going to give you a better lifestyle, knowing that it was important to me to have life balance?
Yeah.
And so I chose physio at the time because I really loved health and I loved working with people. And I started my journey I had a background as an athlete training in platform diving and gymnastics. So I was very interested in sports physiotherapy. And throughout my degree, that's where I saw myself going.
Yeah.
So I started working with sports teams in Canberra and working on the side of an AFL field in the middle of winter and in a very male-dominated sport industry.
Yeah.
I quickly realized that working in sport wasn't for me.
Yeah.
And then I started my journey into yoga. I took some time off and went traveling and started to learn and understand more about yoga. And I did a subject in health psychology and started to really become fascinated between the interplay between the mind and the body, and understanding that as a client, it's so much more than just looking at their injury. We have to look at the big picture. I started to see sort of the flaw, I suppose, in some physiotherapy models that really looked at zooming in so closely on the specific area to work out, what the tendon or structure was that was damaged, without zooming out again and then looking at the whole person. And then I landed in Hervey Bay after spending 6 months traveling through South and Central America. Decided to apply for jobs all over Australia and ended up moving to Hervey Bay.
It's a beautiful spot.
Yeah, which was lovely. And I spent some time working there in just a general private practice. And there was a women's health physio that worked there who had, she was about to go on maternity leave, and she needed someone to take over her caseload. So she basically asked if I could go and do the women's health training and start seeing her pelvic floor clients, because she was fully booked out for like 6 months. It was very in need of pelvic floor physios up there. And for the listeners who are not aware, Hervey Bay is what they call the place of newlyweds and nearly deads. So there is a large retirement population there, which means working closely with the gynecologist up there was a lot of pelvic floor dysfunction as a result of poor antenatal education and postnatal education for that generation. So away I went to do my training with really no idea or no expectation. And after that, I just thought, how is it that I wasn't taught any of this as a woman growing up? It just really blew my mind how little I knew my own body. And then started working in the clinic, seeing lots of women with pelvic floor dysfunction, started to assess pelvic floors, see all sorts of different pelvic floor dysfunction, like major prolapse and urinary incontinence, to women who had never been able to have sex because their pelvic floor was so overactive. So just seeing such a large spectrum. And then I started to apply it to my own. I mean, I was never someone who suffered significantly to the point where I considered seeing someone, but I wouldn't say I had ever had good pelvic floor health. I just didn't know what good pelvic floor health was. So with my background of gymnastics, we were always taught to tense our tummy and hold everything in. So I was constantly gripping around my stomach muscles. I was constantly tensing my pelvic floor. And I remember at times, even when I was younger, if I had been training at gymnastics on the trampoline for really long periods of time with a full bladder, that I would be leaking and think, I wonder if all the other girls get this. I remember struggling with pain with intercourse at times, and never realizing that there was so much that I could do about it. And that none of those things were normal. And when I moved down to the Sunshine Coast, I started working more with pre and postnatal women, and really decided to make it my mission to educate these women so that they wouldn't end up like the generation that I just spent time working with, who had such major pelvic floor dysfunction, mostly because they weren't educated from a young age. And sharing this information, because there's just so much that we can do to support ourselves as women, especially our pelvic floor and our vaginas.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting, like to even reflect on that aspect of the flow-on effect, not having the education or not caring for that area in a way that is super supportive, like what actually happens down the track. Because I've dealt with prolapse in kinesiology quite a bit as well. And it's so common having issues like through that area in that older generation, definitely. Yeah. And it's too late before almost like you realize it's really a problem, hey?
Most of the time it is women that come and see me that have like major problems. Because, and even in my own journey, I didn't think as a young gymnast who was very fit and active that I had a problem. I thought pain with sex was just a normal thing that we had to put up with as women. I didn't think that was a sign that there was an imbalance in my body.
Yeah. So I've had the pain with sex thing too, only in one specific, a little bit with Alex, but with my previous relationship, I suffered with that a lot. I don't know, like obviously there's a big emotional aspect to that as well though, because I didn't really physically do anything to shift that. Maybe all my nutrition and things like that I've changed over the last like 6 years helped. But yeah, I think it's such a common thing to just endure. As women, we tend to endure until it's like to the point of like, oh, we really should say something.
Yeah, absolutely. Until the point where you either can't have sex or it's unbearable.
Yeah. It's funny, like before I got pregnant, I was like trying to find a pelvic floor physio, and I didn't, because I already met you a while ago and I didn't know that you were a pelvic floor physio at the time. But I just wanted to go see someone because I was like, oh, I just really want to make sure, like, I just want to check out the area, make sure everything's all good. Because I did years of ballet and dancing, and I was like, I feel like I tense too much, or like maybe not at the right time, because I've definitely noticed my breath being impacted from doing ballet for so many years. Like I have that reverse diaphragmic breath where I breathe in and suck in and then breathe out and push my belly out. And so it's like this opposite training thing. And that, I mean, that from what I understand from what you've taught me, like the diaphragm is so closely related to the pelvic floor as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So our breath is a huge regulator of our pelvic floor health, and that's where our nervous system really plays into it. So when it comes to our respiratory diaphragm, it's the dome-shaped muscle that sits underneath our rib cage.
Yeah.
And it is regulating our pelvic floor tone. So when we inhale, the diaphragm descends and it stretches, and it subtly stretches the pelvic floor. And then when we exhale, the diaphragm and pelvic floor subtly recoil and they move together.
Yeah.
And when we're breathing in a relaxed state regularly throughout the day, this creates this subtle movement, keeping the pelvic floor in this nice healthy state of being able to stretch and then recoil. But so many women who are breathing into their upper chest, or as you say, reverse chest breathing, are sucking in and lifting and then exhaling, and that's having an effect on the pelvic floor, because the pelvic floor is either it's permanently contracted and it's not able to completely relax, or they're inhaling and contracting.
Yeah.
And that's going to also have an effect on the nervous system. So the vagus nerve also runs through the diaphragm, and it's going to be affected if we're constantly in a fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system response. We're going to start to breathe into our upper chest and create that tension in the pelvic floor. So there's definitely a big element of, as you said, emotional aspect that comes down to stress when it comes to holding tension in the pelvic floor.
And I could imagine how much the flow on effect of that into other areas would transpire, like constipation, or like even like back, or like issues, so like back pain or digestive issues. It all it all relates, doesn't it?
It's all connected. Yeah, absolutely. So the pelvic floor can be anywhere on a spectrum from really overactive to really underactive. And if we continue to dive into that overactive side, so symptoms when it's really, really bad might include pain with intercourse, constipation, even sometimes urinary incontinence, because when the pelvic floor is always on, it becomes really fatigued. So the muscle is meant to work in a state of contraction and relaxation through the day. It's not meant to be in this permanent state of contraction. And if you imagine like the bicep muscle, for example, if I were to ask you to hold a dumbbell in your hand, contracting your bicep for hours of the day, you'd become so fatigued and exhausted, and you'd finally just drop the dumbbell. And then if I just said, hey, can you catch this? And I expected you to be able to contract that muscle, you'd just have no energy or strength left. It would be so fatigued.
Yeah.
So when the pelvic floor is always on, it then won't necessarily respond when we need it to, say when you cough or sneeze or skip at the gym or do something that requires the pelvic floor to quickly contract, or to contract with power or endurance. It's not able to do that if it's really, really fatigued. So overactive pelvic floor could be something where you're showing symptoms, but then, as I said, on this spectrum, there's optimal in the middle, but between optimal and overactive I consider symptomatic. But between that, there's what I call hypertonic, which means that the muscle is still in a state of always on a little bit, but it's not to the point where someone is symptomatic. So they're not necessarily having pain with intercourse yet, but there might be areas in the muscle where they're holding tension and they've got a really poor ability to actually relax the pelvic floor. So they have poor range of motion in the muscle.
Mm-hmm.
So if we think about the bicep again, if you have your arm out straight and then you take your hand to your shoulder, that's the full range of motion of your bicep muscle, being able to lengthen and shorten. And in the pelvic floor, we want this nice ability for it to lengthen and shorten, and we want good movement. But if you're always a little bit on and then you try and contract it, it contracts a little bit and then you release it to still a little bit on, and there's not much movement. So often when I see women who do have this hypertonic pelvic floor, it's about teaching them how to get back to that letting go and that baseline. And that might not be an issue at the time, but it could still predispose them to a higher risk of birth trauma, for instance, or difficulty relaxing the pelvic floor when it comes to labor, or if they get a new partner, for example, who has a bigger penis. There might be deeper penetration, which means more areas that would be sensitive. Or if they have a change in emotional state, like more stress in their life and they're already used to tensing their pelvic floor, it might go from that hypertonic to that place of overactivity. But it's just remembering that we're always moving through this spectrum. So, you know, at one stage in our life, we might be really stressed and overworked and just constantly breathing into our upper chest and constantly, you know, clenching our jaw and gripping our pelvic floor. And that might really show up in our pelvic floor health. But at other times when our lives are more balanced, we might have a more optimal tone. Or at other times, you know, especially after vaginal birth, the pelvic floor is sometimes, it's more lengthened. It's more on that underactive side. So it's just working out at any point in your life, where are you on that spectrum, and having an understanding of that spectrum, knowing how to self-monitor and self-assess and the things that are likely to impact what state the pelvic floor is in.
Fascinating. And would you say that the ways to support or nourish those areas, whether you're one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum, is it the same process, or is it specific to where you are?
It's a similar process, with the focus leaning more towards where you are on that spectrum. So in general, we want to always focus on feeling the contraction and feeling the relaxation. So when we're practicing our pelvic floor, we should feel good range of movement. And I talk about the elevator. So for those listening, what I get my clients to visualize is an elevator shaft running up the vagina. And I explain the connection between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And then I get them to imagine that when we inhale and the diaphragm descends, the pelvic floor, like a trampoline netting, it stretches, and that pushes the elevator down to the basement. And then there's the front and back elevated doors, because there's the two parts of the superficial pelvic floor, which are the muscles around the vaginal entrance and then the muscles around the anus. So there's the front and back elevated doors, closing around the front passage like they're trying to stop urine from passing on the toilet, closing around the back passage like they're trying to stop wind from passing in public. And then they should feel those two close, and then they should feel a sensation of lifting the elevator up and internally, almost like a tampon being lifted up. And that elevator will keep traveling to, let's say, the second floor, and then the lower abdominals, the transversus abdominis, will start to co-contract with the pelvic floor, and then they'll draw it all the way up to the fourth floor around their navel. And they should feel not only the feeling of the sensation of a lift, but very definitely feel that sensation of lowering down each floor. Because sometimes what I see is people can definitely feel the sensation of it turning on, but then they either drop it and it plummets or they try and let it go and it maybe comes back down to the second floor. But I think the elevator helps people to visualize in their mind this idea that we should be getting range of motion of the pelvic floor, moving from the basement when we inhale all the way through to the fourth floor on that exhale breath when we're contracting, and then inhaling and being able to drop it back down. So we definitely always focus on optimizing through contracting and relaxing that full range. But if someone is particularly underactive, we might focus more on learning techniques for feedback to their brain, whether that's inserting a finger vaginally or sitting on a ball or a fit ball, so that they're getting more neural feedback and more proprioception of the area. Or if they're really overactive, we might focus more on learning breath techniques to focus on dropping that elevator down to the basement, checking in throughout the day on what's happening in their bodies. Are they breathing constantly into their upper chest? Are they breathing down into their belly? So on the other side of overactive is if they have a really overactive pelvic floor and they're getting what would be known as vaginismus or a pain response, say with intercourse, then I encourage them to start working on these internal self-release techniques. And we do a lot of work on that in the clinic as well. It's something that I can either perform on them or teach them how to do, or teach them to do with their partner. And it is about releasing the pelvic floor like any other muscle in our body. If we have a really tight, sore lower back, we do often have, we find hands-on techniques like myofascial techniques really effective to release tension in the muscle. So there's the physical aspect in relieving that tightness that might occur anywhere in the pelvic floor. It might be in one particular area. It might be on the right or left side, or more around the entrance. It might be deep around the cervix. But then there is also the emotional component. So if someone comes to see me with what I call vaginismus, which is essentially pain with intercourse, they're getting a pain response because their nervous system is perceiving, and it's usually based around some sort of past trauma that could have been emotional trauma, like sexual abuse, or an experience at one point, like a first sexual encounter that was really painful, or it could be a physical trauma such as endometriosis or a recurrent urinary tract infection or thrush. But what's happened is, from that point, they might have at first had one initial penetration that might have been painful, or something that reminded those muscles to interpret penetration or stretching or movement or any sort of touch of the pelvic floor as painful. So this is where, when I was working in Hervey Bay, I did some work in chronic pain, and I became fascinated in pain science and pain physiology. And there's a pain physiotherapist, and he tells his own story about how he was walking through the bush in Australia and something brushed up against his leg. And what happens is the pain receptors send a muscle to the brain to say, what's happened like this before? Is it dangerous? Is it threatening? And his brain looks in his past history, and there's nothing dangerous in the past history. And so he goes, oh, no, it must just be a twig. But he looks down and he's been bitten by a snake. So then what happens is he's rushed to hospital, given an antivenom, and he survived. But a year later, he was walking through the bush, something brushed up against his leg. Again, pain receptor sends a message to the brain to say, what's happened like this before? Is it dangerous? Is it threatening? And the brain sets off alarm bells, because in the past, there's this trauma. So the subconscious brain, before he even has time to think consciously about it, he is on the ground screaming in agony, grabbing his leg, and he's just brushed up against a twig. So what this really highlights is that the subconscious has a major role in the amount of pain that we respond with. So what happens is, if a woman is experiencing pain with intercourse and her partner starts with, or even pain with menstruation, or pain birthing a baby, There's a message that gets sent to the subconscious brain. What's happened like this before? It looks through its past history. Let's say there's a past history of falling on your ass snowboarding and injuring your coccyx, or recurrent urinary tract infections. It's going to go danger, threat, and the muscles are going to tighten up to protect the area. And then you do, let's say, have intercourse and it's painful, or you do have a menstrual bleed and it's painful, then that's going to create more tension. And then it's just this spiral, and we just keep, it's a pain cycle where until we break that cycle and communicate with the nervous system that it's safe and it's not threatening, we're going to continue to get this response. So this is what I just love sharing with women when it comes to preparing for labor and birth, but also in retraining a pain response that they might, if they're having pain, whether they're someone with painful periods or someone with pain with intercourse, it's retraining the pelvic floor muscles to not contract, because when we contract, we are reducing blood supply, we are restricting blood vessels, so reducing blood supply, reducing oxygen. Periods are going to get more painful. We're constricting the muscles, so the entrance is going to be smaller. We're going to get more pain with penetration, and in labor, a higher risk of tearing. So
yeah, I had a feeling it would lead to that.
Yeah. So in any of these circumstances, we're doing internal release, not just to release the physical aspect of the tightness in the muscle, but by holding pressure there. And this happens remarkably quickly. I've seen women who have never been able to have penetrative intercourse in their life. And within 3 sessions or 4 sessions, and getting to the bottom of what sort of started this response, just by holding pressure on the pelvic floor, teaching them about the pain physiology, teaching them about the breath, trying to teach them the elevator to contract and relax, and holding that tension there. We're saying to the nervous system, this is safe, especially if we're saying that while doing diaphragmatic breathing or while talking, having a conversation that doesn't seem threatening. We're just saying to the nervous system, this pressure, this touch on the pelvic floor, or whatever it is, this is safe. And by holding that pressure there, we're retraining that response. And it's amazing how quickly, the pain can go from 10 out of 10 down to a 3 out of 10 within just a few sessions, or a few sessions of a woman even working internally on herself or with her partner to change that pain response and that physiology. But like you said with your work, it's also looking at the big picture. So if a woman is working like 80 hours a week and she's stressed out of her brains, we can do this work and it's going to come back. Like the pelvic floor is so influenced by the breath and the emotional state. Or, for example, I work a lot, often refer to naturopaths or kinesiologists or dietitians, because of the impact of the vaginal microbiome. If they have a recurrent yeast infection, we can do the work, but if they don't get on top of that vaginal pH and that biome of the vagina, we're still going to end up with this recurrent pain condition. So not only do we have to work out what the trigger was initially and then address that, we can then use these techniques to retrain the nervous system to reinstall a sense of safety in the nervous system, so that when we do get that stretching of the perineum or the pelvic floor during intercourse, monthly during a bleed or during labor, we are responding with, yes, that's a sensation of stretch, not that is excruciating pain.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So powerful, and so much within there that's just so potent. And I think that everyone was doing their pelvic floor exercise with you as you were pulling it up and the elevator back down. I know I was. So it just, as soon as you talk about it, even if you haven't been taught that much, everyone kind of knows what Kegels are, I guess. So it's great that there's a level of awareness, but there's just so much more within there to dive deeper. And it sounds like it's super important to address these things before we move into the stage of pregnancy, or I'm sure that it affects fertility in ways too.
100%. Yeah. Especially Well, for starters, we need sex we need to have penetrative intercourse to conceive.
Yeah, if you can't do that, then that's where you got to start.
Yeah, or even to have a speculum inserted for an egg retrieval. So definitely we need the pelvic floor to be able to relax, and we need it to be able to relax to orgasm, because an orgasm is that release of the pelvic floor. So definitely we know now in fertility that there is some role of a female orgasm in helping with fertility and conception. So definitely working with the pelvic floor physio pre-conception can be helpful, and working out if there is an issue, if you're always getting thrush or bacterial vaginosis or urinary tract infections, working out if something's going on with vaginal pH or with your gut health, or working out if it's a hormonal issue, regulating your cycle, and then working on the pelvic floor tone and optimizing the health of your vagina and your ability to contract and relax the pelvic floor so that you can achieve sexual intercourse with pleasure and achieve an orgasm in order to conceive, and then go through the journey of pregnancy and birth your baby without hopefully minimal intervention and a lower risk of tests.
Yeah, I love there's so many women doing this work, like in the embodiment and like the sensuality space, and it's all the de-armoring, because it obviously helps so much just to bring that care and that energy to that space. But I would be surprised if no one had ever like de-armored before, but that no one held trauma there, because I think that the vagina is like a sponge, like it just sponges up everything, like just things. Like I've done de-armoring before and been like, well, I didn't even like thought of that for like the last 6 years, and that random thing came in whilst I'm doing that. I'm like, oh my God, my vagina is a sponge.
Yeah, it really is. And it's so influenced by emotional state, which is unlike any muscle in our body. When we smell something, or when we hear something, or when we see something, we can become physically aroused in the pelvic floor. And there's not really any other muscle in our body that is going to have such significant change in response to what's happening on an emotional level in our brains.
Yeah, so fascinating. It's why it's so important to like care for this area. And it's amazing that it's not it's still taboo in a lot of ways, but it's a lot less taboo than it was to talk about poo, wee, vaginas, orgasms, menstruation, like even all the things they're changing in the supermarkets to not be like a sanitary product, because that's just a patriarchal term, because you're unsanitary when you're on your period, to change that to say period care. Like that's such a big step into our psychology, isn't it? Oh my gosh.
And I feel like we're on the brink of a massive shift in our generation. It's exciting. It's exciting to be a part of that.
It so is. I'm reading childbirth as a rite of passage at the moment. So powerful. And like I feel like I've known a lot of that stuff because I've been in the realm of like sacral care, let's say, maybe not specifically pelvic care, but I've worked with eggs and stuff like that. But all the information in there about midwifery and like how the patriarchal societal view came in and like kind of changed things, and how we've gotten to be in like even the hospital system and why that's happened is so fascinating to
the red thread.
To look through, and like all the stuff post World War II that like got initiated because so many people died. So therefore they were like, we need to care for the population. So we need to make sure we're looking over these women that are pregnant and making sure that they're okay. But actually it's led to so much more intervention, which leads to more complication. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And in that older generation, I think it's harder to reach them. There is more reluctance to speak openly about vaginas and periods and acknowledge if they're suffering from some sort of dysfunction like urinary incontinence or prolapse or pain. But they are just the most appreciative patients, because it's something that they have suffered in silence for so long often, that when you do finally have the opportunity to treat them, it's such a huge impact on their quality of life.
Yeah, so powerful. I've seen some like things on, is it on Instagram or like TikTok or something, where when a woman is quite heavily pregnant and then she practices like the sucking in of her belly and then pushing it out. I'm assuming that would like relate into the diaphragm and the pelvic floor in some way. Is that a toning thing? And like, do you know how that helps or how that works in terms of making things better in labor and your body for afterwards?
Yeah. So as I said, there's that really close connection fascially between the pelvic floor and the transversus abdominis. The transversus abdominis is like our deepest core layer. It's like our corset. It wraps around our belly. And as I said, it really closely connects. So when we contract our pelvic floor, our transversus abdominis should co-contract if the connection is working properly.
Yeah.
So for a while in the Pilates industry, and even in the physio world, actually, they became obsessed with transversus abdominis work. And they forgot that the pelvic floor is the tool to get the transversus abdominis to contract. And we focus so much on just contracting around the corset muscle. Yeah. Because you can contract the transversus abdominis on its own.
Yeah.
But when you contract the pelvic floor, the transversus abdominis works as well, if it's working properly. So by focusing just on the transversus abdominis, it's like squeezing around the middle of a water balloon, and the pressure will go to the weakest point. So the pressure tended to go down to the pelvic floor. So that's not helpful. What we want to do is contract the pelvic floor first, and then like that elevator, the transversus abdominis will start to contract. And if you, for any of our listeners, if you pop your fingers just on the inside of your hip bones, or if you're pregnant on your belly, and then do that pelvic floor contraction that we spoke about, you'll feel the muscles underneath contract, and you'll feel baby hugging towards the spine. And that's from contracting the pelvic floor and transversus abdominis, but it's always better to focus on that lift up and in of both.
Yes.
And we need those muscles to be strong to support our backs, to minimize risk of SI joint pain and pelvic girdle pain in pregnancy. And it's going to help with obviously posture, but we also want them to be able to relax. So I think it's a real balance between teaching women to contract and relax, which is why I do love both Pilates and yoga. Yeah, because I think they really complement each other in that way. But some women I see who have done a lot of Pilates and gym work, when they fall pregnant, those muscles they've never switched off in their life, especially the external obliques, which run across and sometimes give you that sort of appearance at the top of the ribs of where it turns into the six-pack kind of muscles. But they don't know how to switch those off. And so they're rock hard. And then when the rib cage tries to expand, because the rib cage flares out laterally during pregnancy to make room for the growing baby, the ribs kind of won't move out properly, and they get sort of stuck because they're trying to fight this sort of losing battle against the external obliques. Yeah. And then they get a lot of upper rib pain. So for them, it's really important to teach them how to switch off, to let go of the belly. Yeah. And learn how to breathe. But then it is also important, because there's lots of women, and there's a lot of studies now on functional strengthening of the obliques and of the transversus abdominis and the core in prevention of pelvic girdle and lower back pain in pregnancy. So we know that by having good strength in those muscles, good ability to contract them, we're going to minimize risk of pain and dysfunction. So yeah, I think it's just this fine balance between not teaching people how to turn it on when we're exercising, but then equally throughout the rest of the day, teaching them how to turn it off, especially if we are just sitting and resting. Yeah, so true. When we don't need our tummy always on.
Yeah, really, and that societal thing of like, suck your tummy in, Suck your tummy in. It's one of the worst things we can do for our pelvic floors. Yeah, it's great. Pregnancy is like the best excuse to move through something like that, because you're like, actually, just let it out. So much more comfortable, isn't it?
Definitely.
It's interesting. Like, obviously, I've had pelvic girdle pain, which I was planning to see you anyway, but it just happened to pop up like the day before my first session with you. And I thought, like, I think what I thought was happening, you said, seemed to be quite accurate. Like, that I have a lot of tightness in my left side and a lot of flexibility in my right side. And so it's like trying to find the balance between. And I even noticed that, like, in my ribs, in my diaphragm, my right side is very like, I can move it really easily, and my left side does not have much movement in my rib area. And then as everything obviously softens through pregnancy, then things can just be more exacerbated or flare up. In that right hip is where I was having the hip pain kind of coming on, and now I'm doing lots of things to support that.
Yeah. Definitely pregnancy is a time that if there's any underlying musculoskeletal imbalance or tightness or sort of rotation in the pelvis, or the thorax is slightly asymmetrical, things will start to really come out in pregnancy because of the hormonal changes, but also because of the weight distribution changes in pregnancy as well.
The other thing that I've noticed, and I talked to you about this when I was in our last session, is like, obviously there's softening like through like the pubic area, and how awesome that actually is in a way. Like, there's so much more like juiciness and like an easier opening, I guess, I've noticed since being pregnant, in terms of like having sex or those sorts of things. Why does that happen? Do you know? Sexual beings. It
is to do with hormonal changes. So hormonal fluctuation in pregnancy. There's obviously increased levels of estrogen and progesterone during the early stages of pregnancy, but it's also something that most women don't know about. And so often women sometimes disclose to me, and I've been having like really a lot of discharge. It's quite embarrassing. I'm having to wear a pad or a liner because of the amount of vaginal discharge and secretions, especially towards the end of pregnancy. It's not well spoken about, and so they think there's something wrong with them. Or they think they're leaking urine, but it is actually just vaginal discharge.
Just beautiful, juicy flow.
That's right.
So special. That's so cool.
Just all of the things. There's so many things that can happen in pregnancy that we don't talk about or know about until they happen.
Like, I didn't know about like, it makes sense, like, if you think about it, to not be doing like straight up and down ab work, like only obliques. But I didn't know, like, from however how many weeks is it that you're supposed to stop doing like sit-ups and things like that. Well, I think it was like 8 weeks, you said to me, no more. It depends.
I think it's good to get into a good habit as soon as you find out you're pregnant, just to sort of start to install these altered movement patterns into your conscious. But there's sort of 2 reasons that I explain it. And the first is, the main thing is to do with the linea alba, which is a layer of connective tissue and fascia that runs down the middle of our rectus abdominis muscle. So the rectus abdominis muscle is our six-pack muscle. That runs at the very front of our abdominals, of our core. And rather than it being a 3-pack, it's a 6-pack, because it has this
line down the middle,
layer of connective tissue in the middle connecting it, which is kind of like a piece of blue tack, a long thin piece of blue tack. And during pregnancy, that blue tack gets stretched and those muscles slightly move apart to stretch with the rounding of the belly. And then if we're doing a lot of shortening exercises, it's going to be, because the origin will move towards the attachment, at the point where they start to become sort of more like a long oval in the middle. When the origin moves towards the insertion, we're going to be creating more of a gap in the middle. So that can lead to worsening of abdominal separation.
And that's what sometimes people have a lot of issue with, like postpartum, is their abdominals don't like join back together very easily. Is that true?
Yeah, it's more commonly that the fascial integrity doesn't return because they don't do specific exercises to build back that connective tissue strength. It's like, if we think about the blue tack, if we really thin it out and then we kind of just bring it back together, you can imagine how squishy it would be. Like, and in really severe cases, you know, you can almost feel the abdominal organs underneath.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. But that's pretty rare. Yeah. Most of the time, it's just that we need to acknowledge the enormous transformation that happens in the female body during pregnancy and during childbirth. And that is lengthening and stretching of the abdominal wall massively, and all of these muscles, plus lengthening and stretching of the pelvic floor in huge amounts during vaginal birth. So postpartum, the aim is to start to shorten those muscles and to return integrity and strength back in those muscles. And because a lot of mums, their entire focus is on the baby, they don't spend the time necessarily honoring their body in that way and doing exercises or movements specific to targeting the shortening of the pelvic floor and the re-strengthening of the pelvic floor, or the re-strengthening of all of the abdominal layers that have stretched, but particularly that rectus abdominis layer that's stretched the most and that has that fascial layer that's really thinned out and moved apart.
Yeah, and I really see how that could play out, definitely. And you know, and then you let it go, and then maybe you don't do your pelvic floor stuff, and then all of a sudden, like, you're just having these issues that you have to work even harder to resolve. Okay. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So
and then things like, if you don't have that abdominal cavity strength and you're lifting up a sort of 10-kilo toddler and a 3.5 kilo baby, pretty quickly you're going to develop things like pain. And then if you're straining to lift, the pressure is going to the weakest point. So when we strain, if you imagine the core is like a water balloon with the diaphragm at the top and the pelvic floor at the bottom and all of those abdominal muscles at the front and the back muscles at the back. If we're squeezing that water balloon, say around the top, we're going to have the pressure go either down to the pelvic floor, which can increase risk of prolapse, or if someone's had a cesarean, it might be to the cesarean scar. Someone has abdominal separation, it might be squeezing it and going out the midline through that fascia, which is called doming. Or if they have, say, a hernia, it might be squeezing and pushing all the pressure to the hernia. If they've got hemorrhoids, it might be squeezing all that pressure and making the hemorrhoid worse. So it's just understanding that the pressure will go to the weakest point. So we need ways to manage pressure and to have the strength so that we don't have to strain. That's so potent, so important. I really this has been so informative. I just love everything that you talk about, Caitlin. I'm so glad. I have really awesome. Hoped it. I just want to share this knowledge because it's so important. We need to know these things. I can't believe we don't learn this in our anatomy subjects in school. You know, I know. It should be basic anatomy. Yeah. I know. Anatomy of the pelvic floor. Yeah, absolutely. Totally. And how it relates, because it relates to so many things. Yeah. And then it shows up in ways either relating to poos, wees, or sex or menstruation, but it might show up subtly. And as women, we're very dismissive of subtle messages. Yeah. And it's often not until the message becomes a huge impactor of our daily lives that we, years down the track, finally build up the courage to do something about. So I really urge women, even as a preventative tool, to see a women's health physio. I see people both online and teach them how to self-assess, or in person and do the assessment if that's what they would like. So just to become more aware of this part of our body and to know what is normal and what is healthy and what is optimal. Yeah. And then when you do start to deviate slightly from that, how to manage it and how to get back to optimal.
Yeah. There's one other thing I want to bring up because you were telling me to moo when I poo.
Mm-hmm.
And the importance of sound with the pelvic floor. And I love this because I talk about this in my women's circles for years, how the throat and the vagina are so intricately connected. So like those vocal cords and the pelvic floor being so connected. And when we sing like at different pitches, like it definitely affects that area. So you were telling me to moo when I poo.
Yeah.
which was so funny because I think I told you I was doing that at my mum's house, and I didn't tell her that I was like doing that process. And she's like, what are you doing in there? And I just like thought it was funny that she didn't know it was like a little thing we had to laugh over. But it's an awesome tool to.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you do have if you're feeling a bit constipated or having trouble passing a bowel motion, because when we hold our breath, we're squeezing that water balloon, and that is going to increase risk of prolapse, especially with chronic constipation if it's happening all the time. Whereas if we're opening the glottis and letting the air travel out, it's going to have a much better impact. And the pelvic floor is also connected not only to the respiratory diaphragm but to the voice box. So when we use high pitched tones, it increases tone in the pelvic floor, increases tone in the diaphragm. When we use low pitched tones, it decreases tone in the diaphragm, decreases tone in the pelvic floor. And that obviously is what we need, because we need the pelvic floor, when it's too tight, it closes the anal sphincter, it blocks it off, so that can lead to constipation. So we want the pelvic floor to relax, and using those low tones will also help with a subtle pressure down of the diaphragm, which will create almost like a coffee plunger effect, helping the stool pass down and out.
So clever. And I'm sure that's why women, when they're birthing, they often are making these like deep guttural sounds, because it's allowing the baby to drop down lower and lower through.
It's creating a subtle downward pressure. Helping the baby to move down with the uterine contractions, allowing oxygen to still travel in and out, calming the nervous system. It's just one of the most powerful but simple tools.
I love it. So good. I've got some fun questions for you, Caitlin, that I ask everyone that come on. If you know it, what is your sun, moon, and rising sign?
My sun is in Leo. I don't know my rising sign or my moon sign.
Oh, we'll have to look it up. Hold on, let's look it up quickly. I'll do it for you, because it's just fun to know.
Yeah.
Right, let's pull up your chart. Okay, so you've got your sun in Leo, you've got your moon in Gemini. So your moon is like your emotions, your relationship. It's like you kind of how you deal with things when you're feeling more introverted and how you relate with other people. It's like that kind of more shadow side of yourself. And then your ascendant or your rising is the first part of you that's developed. So it can be focused on in astrology because it's how you look generally. It's how you come across to people at the beginning as well. So ascendant in Pisces is nice. It's like a very romantic, deep sign. Like deep Pisces love a deep chat. Like they want to go deep, you know? It's funny because I was going to guess that you were a water sign, but that was obviously what I was picking up on in that. And then your Gemini moon would probably mean that you're very intelligent, like emotionally, but you're also very indecisive. Like you could have multiple different things that you could go with. And it's like always trying to find the balance of being able to incorporate all of those things into the one self, because it's the twins.
The twins,
yeah. Anyway, that's just a basic information. Do you know your human design?
Yes, I am a manifesting generator.
Yeah, perfect. What is your favorite fruit?
I would say mango.
Yeah, I can't wait for mango season.
Love mango season.
I'm going to be birthing in mango season.
Oh,
isn't that just the dream?
Yeah.
That's all I'm so excited for. I'm like, I'm going to be in labor. I'll be like, I need some more mango.
Oh, I love mango.
so good. What's your favorite kind of mango? Do you have a specific one you like, or any? Take any.
Any, really?
Yeah.
Love them all. Don't discriminate.
If you could return to one moment in your life and re-experience it again, what would you return to witness?
There's a night very ingrained in my memory, and I was traveling through Central America, and we went to Cuba, and it was in this small town square, and they were having a lot like live music, and everyone in the town square was salsa dancing, and we danced all night long, and it was just the most fun I think I've ever had.
Oh, that sounds so joyful and playful. I love it.
Yeah, it was just incredible. It was
That's when I'm like, oh yeah, you're a Leo. With that being your story.
Yeah, definitely a Leo.
Forest or ocean?
Ocean.
What is there a plant or a flower that you work with the most?
I love sunflowers,
and
I think it's a great analogy watching a sunflower open up.
Yeah.
As the pelvic floor and perineum opens up in birth.
I love that. Do you have a favorite crystal?
I wouldn't say a favorite, no. Okay. Maybe rose quartz.
Yeah, can't go wrong with rose quartz. And if you're an animal, what would you be?
Oh, that's such a hard one. I've thought about that a lot.
That's the hard one. That's funny.
Yeah. I like to see my spirit animal as an eagle.
Yeah.
I love the idea of flying and being free. Like freedom is a word that resonates so much with me. And I do also just love the ocean and feel so at home in the ocean. So maybe a manta ray or an eagle, which I think an eagle ray.
No, I was going to say, I've been about a year ago, I was really obsessed with looking into dolphin midwives. I don't know if you've explored this at all, but I listened to a podcast the other day and they were talking about dolphin midwives. And I was like, I could see you as a dolphin midwife, Caitlin.
Okay.
Setting the sonar, you know.
So what is a dolphin midwife trained to do? I've heard of them, but I'm not familiar with.
I don't think it's the fact that they're trained. I think it's that they intuitively are very drawn to women who are like super pregnant, and they send sonar waves to the baby and the mum to like heal whatever blockages are like happening in their field. Wow. And like their brains are very similar to ours, and the way that they mate is very similar to us in terms of like it being for pleasure. And so there's this real they say that if you're in the water and there's babies or pregnant women, they will always go for like they want to come and be close to those things. So they're like this very supportive, like mothering kind of nature. So cool. Yeah,
so cool.
Yeah.
What would your animal be?
I think most of the time I would choose dolphin.
Dolphin, wow.
Yeah.
I do love dolphins too.
Yeah, they're just so amazing.
Wow.
The more that I learn about them as a being is just really interesting. Like whales are also amazing for like that kind of energy and that wisdom, but I don't think I have whale energy at all. I think I have more like cat like energy than a whale. Like it'd be a dolphin or like some sort of cat, like a lioness or something.
Yeah.
What's
your sun?
Oh yeah, my sun is Aquarius, my moon is Capricorn, and my rising is Virgo.
Okay.
So I've got a lot of earthiness going on, but I'm an air sign. Woo.
Yeah. What's so you said Leo, Gemini, and
I'll send it to you. Yeah, Leo, Gemini, and Pisces. I'll send you the whole thing.
Yeah.
We can talk about it more another time. Is there any last words or summations you want to leave the listeners with before maybe we share about how they can get in touch with you?
I'd say just honoring the interconnectedness of our bodies. And that means both the emotional and physical aspects. as well as the interconnectedness between systems like reproduction, digestion, our vaginas, our bowels, everything.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So cool. And if people want to work with you online or in person or get in touch or listen to your podcast, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so they can jump on my website. It's herwomenshealth.com, and they can book in either, if they're local to the Sunshine Coast, they can book in for an in-person assessment, or if they are elsewhere in the world, then they can book in for a telehealth online session.
Amazing. And your podcast is her, or
Things
they didn't tell her.
And they can find that on my website or on any podcasting.
Yeah, and you're really usually breaking down things about the pelvic health and pregnancy. And
yeah, it's mostly centered around pregnancy, postpartum, and I do have a couple of episodes coming up soon on menstrual health.
Cool. And are you also offering your like programs for Pilates and like in terms
yoga?
of
so I have an 8-week course that I run. It's called Support Your Mind, Core and Pelvic Floor, and it's for pregnant women to learn how to support themselves physically and emotionally in pregnancy and take that into labor and postpartum, as well as a little bit of birth education and knowledge, but really understanding how to support themselves, which I think is probably the most important thing when it comes to birth anyway, is being able to learn tools, breath work, and connect in with their physical body and emotional body and minimize stress or fear. And then I run an 8-week program postpartum as well that's called Restore Your Core, and it's dependent on the type of birth they've had. So I have that broken down into Restore Your Core after cesarean birth, vaginal birth, and vaginal birth after episiotomy or perineal tears. So really it's individually tailored to ensure that we're getting the appropriate recovery of the muscles and also supporting them emotionally to process whatever type of birth they've had.
Yeah, perfect. And you don't have to be pregnant to come and see you for pelvic care either. Just want to remind everyone of that.
Yes. Yeah. I often get inquiries saying, do you see women pre-conception? And I say, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, after everything we've spoken to today, I'm like, wish I did this years ago.
Yeah. It's just, I'm just so grateful that I learned this knowledge from a young age.
Well, thank you so much for speaking about all this information that you are so well educated on. It's been really easy and wonderful to listen to. So thank you so much for coming.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's been fun. And I really hope that all of the listeners have taken something out of it.
Thanks.